All right. This particular rhetoric that the Jews have taken this city from Islamic people cannot be taken seriously historically. I hope to present a convincing case here today that will defend my premise on why I believe Israel, or for that matter, the Jews did not steal Jerusalem. A two-state solution will never achieve peace in the Middle East, and expose and I hope to expose overlooked verifiable facts that cannot be disputed by an objective observer. There are many factors hindering common people, politicians, and the world from seeing who are the real culprits behind this conflict, and I hope to expose those factors here tonight. Jews in Jerusalem, or to be modern, Israel and Jerusalem go together and is as direct like bacon and eggs, hot dogs and mustard, Nashville and country music. Good night to my opponent. Thank you for agreeing to debate this very important issue, which is very personal to me, and to call out for providing us this platform to challenge each other's ideas. It's my hope we stay on topic in this debate and keep it clean.
Thanks again for the debate, Sebastian. I'm really happy to talk to you again tonight. I just saw a black on my screen. Is everything? I hope everything's okay. Give me a thumbs up if everything's okay on your side. Okay, great. Yeah, I wonder what that was about. Really, this is your debate. So before I can give my contentions, I'd like to hear some more of what you have to say. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it back to you.
Perfect. I would like to first start out by saying that this land, Israel, was not always called Israel historically. It was once called Canaan, and historically, according to the way I understand it, Abraham is the descendant of the Jewish people, and he had historically purchased Cave Matpeor in Hebron, and he buried his wife Sarah there. Abraham, no, he even was buried there. Isaac, his son, Rebecca, Jacob, and Leah were all people that were buried in this particular region of the world. And so today, this claim that that they have in the 1960s stolen Jerusalem from the Islamic people who are the rightful heirs, it's really something that has come, in my opinion, to be popular mythology substantiated with no historical facts. I will pass it back to you now.
Okay. So there's two very basic and simple contentions. I can make your 2 points. I think that your first point, just to read back to you, is that biblical history supports your idea that Israel and Jerusalem are the same thing. Is that correct? Just thumbs up. Okay. And your second point, you said that in the 1960s, that Israel stole Jerusalem in the 1960s, and that the rest of the narrative must be a myth. So your first point is really easy for me to contend with. Looks like I have about a minute, but basically, Judaism is not a nationality; it's a religion and an ethnicity. And your second point, I'll have a minute, and that's going to take a little bit longer to explain. But you were talking about the 1960s. Basically, this conflict, it really goes back to Napoleon, but we have the Balfour Declaration, and then in the 1940s it becomes a civil war where both sides, but especially the Israeli side in interest of a state, they attack not only each other but the British who are occupying. So the British leave basically, and they let the United Nations come in, and the United Nations they make this an international city. But in the 48 war, Israel takes the east side, and then later on in the 60s, they take the west side. So that it's a very different narrative. Unfortunately, I only have about 10 or 15 seconds, so I can't elaborate beyond that. So I'll go ahead and pass it back to you.
So during the 1960 war, I just want to clarify that during the 1960 war, This was the Palestinian Arabs and the other Arab nations attempt to take over land from Israel that they had occupied, and so so that was only the Israel defending itself. And so in defending themselves against the invasion that came against them, they ended up fortunately conquering more land and taking more land away from the Palestinian Arabs, when the Palestinian Arabs actually had more land prior to the invasion than they had after the invasion. So it's not really the Jews were the aggressors during that war. It was more of the Arabs being the aggressors, and due to being so, I mean, aggressive and irritating the Jews, they lost more land than they actually previously had. Now, I want to piggyback on I believe you mentioned a claim about this dates back to Napoleon, this land. I want to go further than Napoleon. We could go further than Napoleon, because Jerusalem predates the Islamic conquest. When the Islamic Arabs, as we know them historically, Islamic Crusaders conquered Jerusalem, they picked the holiest areas of the Jews and went on top of the temple to build a mosque. That mosque, what's interesting is that it was built exactly 100 years after Muhammad died. What I have come to believe about this symbolic event is that Arabs believe this mosque will seal the hopes of any Jew to revive this Temple Mount and ever rebuild it again. If this historical event doesn't blatantly communicate who conquered who and took the holy site, Jerusalem, from another nation, it is clear that there is something internally impeding anybody's ability to accept what is clearly a black and white issue. And I will pass it back to you now, 5 seconds.
Okay. I think when you're talking about the 1960 war, you're really jumping there. What you call the 1960 war, it's really the 1967 war, of course. You're really jumping ahead in history, because even if this did start before Napoleon, you're forgetting the 48 war, which is the most important thing, and that's a result of the partition plan. So the United Nations, when they took over, they decided to split this into two states that were both nation states. So they're both a nationalist state, and this is a very important thing to consider when you think about and talk about this conflict, is that they're both nationalist states, but that Jerusalem is defined as an international city. So I think the best way, and this is my main contention, is that it needs to be an international city, because that's the only fair way that all these major religions will be able to access these sites. And you keep going back to the Bible, but as I already iterated, and you're not really moving this point forward, that it's not a nationality, it's an ethnicity. That it's an ethnicity, and it's also religion that I have relatives who are in practice. But yeah, I think you're really dropping the ball on the history here, because it starts. Well, let me talk about the 48 war to probably put this in perspective. Yes, the Jordanians came in, and yes, they took the western city, where the old city of Jerusalem, where it's in the middle, it's where these holy sites are. They took that, but it was to answer the Jewish, having a Jewish state as their neighbor, because they wanted to protect those holy sites for themselves. And well, I only have 5 seconds, so I'll leave it at that.
I disagree that Jerusalem is an international city. That is supposed to be I guess you say be able to be visited by. I mean, that can still happen with Jewish occupation. And what the Israelites are really concerned about is the fact that when they have seen historically, when they give over land, whether it was the Gaza Strip, whether it was the West Bank, or whether it was the PLO peace accord with Clinton in the 1993, I believe it was, when they escaped, when they left the Gaza and gave it to the PLO authorities. What one would expect when they give over land was peace. And so what happened when they give over these territories was Palestinians have built tunnels for missiles and launched them into Israel to really try to get rid of Israel, because they can't stand the fact that Israel is their neighbor. And my point here is that the Jews do not want this to be occurring in the capital, and so yes, I agree with your notion, partially, that yes, this should be available, but it's all issue I'm having with you about who should occupy it, who should be the rightful heirs about it, and I believe the Jews would do a better job of occupying the land and making it safe for tourists than a Palestinian authority would, because of the many documented quotes they have said to want to exterminate the Jews and want to commit terrorist attacks against them. Now, to piggyback on 1948, the Jews never ruthlessly displaced the native population of Arabs in Palestine during the War of Independence. In fact, the Arabs' high command are the ones who urgently encouraged Arabs by radio to voluntarily flee Palestine so that they could better slaughter the Jews. It's documented 350,000 Palestinian Arabs have fled Palestine voluntarily since the War of Independence of 1948. Many Palestinian Arabs did not. And that was the best. Those who did not leave, that was the best decision, because today they comprise of 60% of Israel's voters, and so it was.
Okay, so you're still not moving this history forward. You're talking. You started talking about the 90s before you got back to the 60s, and when you were talking about the 90s, you were actually talking about the 2000s. What was different in the 90s with Bill Clinton? I know we talked about this before, is that Yasser Arafat, because he recognized Israel, he was they got the peace process going, and it created a lot of hope because he had recognized Israel, and he was allowed to kind of create a central government. Like I hinted at you before, it's not really a central government because there's a lot more to it that I won't be able to explain to contend to your points. He started kind of really talking about the Palestinians in a way that I think is actually and not a nice way. I'm just going to leave it at that. Yes, like that's why I mentioned that they're both nationalist. So the nationalism and the hate, it's on both sides here. And no, I'm not trying to say that I don't believe everything the Palestinians ever did was hunky dory, but I do sympathize with them and believe that they're the underdog. And interestingly, the reason that the Arab states did not recognize Israel is because because it was supposed to be an international city, and they took the east side of it in 48, which was dominantly Jewish anyway. But once they took it, they actually expelled the Muslims 3 days later who lived there, who lived near who lived near the old city, even though the old city is part of West Jerusalem. They didn't have that yet. Anyway, they began expelling them immediately. So as far as them telling people to flee in 48, I've never heard that before. I wish I had more time to talk about 67, but the ones who fled are the ones that I forgot to mention, that I really feel bad about, because they can't even go to the Palestinian territories now. They lost everything. Your turn.
I disagree with your point that Arafat actually recognized Jerusalem as an international city, or Israel for that matter, as their neighbors. And I have documentation here that I really use for this debate, and I feel it will be useful, and hopefully will help you out as well, because after the Israeli PLO peace accord meetings that was signed, many of the Palestinian citizens were not happy with Arafat, and so he later said in a quote, he said, "In the name of Allah, I am not considering the Israeli PLO peace accord more than an agreement signed between our prophet Muhammad and Quraysh tribe. Peace for us means destruction of Israel." And so historically, what he's referring to is that when Muhammad, his prophet, had negotiated peace with the Quraysh tribe in, I believe it was 620 AD, the peace was for 10 years. And after 2 years into the peace deal, he invaded them, killed the fathers of the children, and took their wives and enslaved them. And so when he says this, I mean, in your mind, what does this communicate? Does this communicate someone that is sincere about peace, or recognizing the peace deal, or recognizing Israel, or does this sound like someone that is that is playing a gimmick of deception to sort of make their enemy feel a certain way about them, and then sneak attack them and take over territory from them, where they can hopefully someday be in great position to launch the final blow? Now, I give you this documented statistic. Now, I would like you to answer that question. I would pass it to you prematurely.
So your question, you're asking me to support. You're claiming that I have to somehow support the Arafat said something about destroying Israel. And the thing is, he was the game changer here. I'm not claiming that he was he was the greatest leader they have, but I'm not claiming to like follow him or because they don't really have a central government, and this is actually how Hamas was created. Because he wanted to make peace, and he recognized Israel where more radical factions didn't. So that's actually how Hamas got started. I think this is really a legal issue. I mean, the title here is stolen, so it's a legal issue. So I mean, it's kind of really pointless to kind of go over everything that happened, because I have to literally research every single event. But I've obviously given a better timeline. I like to see these events on a timeline than you have, explaining 48 and 67. You say it's a gimmick of deception. I think that's an interesting statement, as much as I want to talk about 67, because the thing, because your side is not following. Your side was given the authority to create a state, and it uses that same authority under the United Nations with these occupations, by doing things like taking Jerusalem by force and building there. So I think it's a legal question. I wish we could just talk about this openly, because I'd like to cite some sources and talk more about that. But every time I get into it, I only have a few seconds left. So yeah, back to you.
Question: in what year was Israel given a right by the UN to establish a state? Tell me the year.
Well, I mean, in 1919, with the Balfour Declaration, it just recommended that they split into two. Well, it was 1917. I'm sorry. So in 1917, they recommended splitting into two states. It wasn't until 1947 that you had the British Mandate, and of course, then you had the partition plan that split it in half. But both these documents called for a nationalist and a nationalist Arab state. So the nationalism had already been acknowledged. There was a civil war going on already, and then they both called Jerusalem an international city. And they also gave Israel, even though they're only 10% of the population, they had 55% of the land in total to begin with. But that didn't include Jerusalem, though, or any of these holy sites. So I mean, it kind of happens. So and then moving on in history, they take the west side and the holy sites in 67. So you have 1917, 1947, 1948. Then you have 1967. And then what's also important is 1980. And of course, I'm forgetting, I haven't talked about any of the Security Council resolutions, but they start in 48. But in 1980, Israel annexes the west side, and that includes all the citizens who live there, and that creates a really bad situation for the citizens who live there, because they immediately build 12 colonies, and in present day they have colonies all around it. So basically the result is that these people, they're not citizens of Israel. They have a strong burden of proof. With that's all I can say with about 20 seconds, is they have a strong burden of proof to become a citizen of Israel. So they can't vote, and really they don't even have basic human rights. They don't have any kind of city service, so they wouldn't have, like, say like a sewer system or anything. It's very primitive, the system that they have in comparison to the rest of the city.
Okay, that last comment I really disagree with. But however, you kept referring to the 1960 war, so I want to definitely get my thoughts on that, and I want to make sure I address it. And so what I'm gonna say about the 1967 war is that I have contradictory statements to make to yours. Is that I personally researched and have found that Israel has observed millions of immigrants, more than 1 million Palestinian Arabs from refugee camps, and they came under Israeli control in the 1967 Six-Day War. Israeli Jews has offered them, they have offered them various resources, including They gave them like state land, electricity, sanitation, streets, schools, and even extended assistance to the point of I believe they built it documented 9 residential projects housing 10 with that housed 10,000 Palestinian Arab families. Now my question is, why is it that Arab nations opposed to Israel help for the refugees at the 1967 UN summit? Why are they so opposed to them? And I'm going to give a quote here to substantiate my case. Because while Israel was doing this in 1967 for the Palestinians, they opposed it. In the Arab League of Nations, it's quote saying, it says, Arab League of Nations at the UN, the General Assembly demand that Israel desist from the resettlement of Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip. And in another quote, they said the General Assembly calls once again upon Israel to refrain from any action that leads to the resettlement of Palestine refugees in the West Bank. I mean, what is going on here? Why are you so against Israel establishing settlements in their part of the land for your Palestinian Arab refugees who are in essence your brethren?
Okay. Well, I think the easiest way to answer that is, how is it a settlement on your own land? They took this land through force, and that's the West Bank and Gaza. And they don't want that. I mean, it's supposed to be 2 states. It's supposed to be 2 nation states, and that's the way it's defined in international law. And those laws aren't being upheld, so they're not supposed to be colonizing there. And they're really doing this in a way that makes it impossible for the Palestinians to have a state, especially in this case of Jerusalem, and if it were stolen or not, because they not only are occupying the land through military force by making it a military zone, they immediately start building colonies around it in the West Bank that box in the Western city that would be traditionally Arab. So basically, it's systematically taking land, and they also break the resources up. They're already treating this as their own land, and because in their constitution they're a Jewish state, that means they have an ethnic majority of Jewish people. That means that they control the resources. So this is mostly a desert region, so that means they control all the farmland and the water, and so forth and so on. I think it's broken into 3 zones actually, and through the agriculture and resources and all that sort of thing. So no, I don't think it can be a settlement if it's on land that you would legally possess. So they don't legally possess this. And maybe I can probably talk about the 67 wars to say it wasn't the 6-day war, it was the 6-minute war. Egypt never even got a plane off the ground. Yeah, they were waiting in the Sinai. They were waiting for trouble. Everyone knew it was going to break out again. But Israel aggressed that, and they had planned the attack for years. And they have abused.
By force, I want to contradict by force. You, like, for our viewers as well, I want to make sure that we clarify what force means. I mean, because by force, when you say colonizing, it was not the Jews being the aggressors. It is well documented that the Arabs were the one who initiated the invasion, and in protecting themselves, they were able to take land from the Arabs that the Arabs were not using for useful purposes of building settlements for their Palestinian Arab people. Rather, they were using it as sites to prepare military strikes against Israel. All right, and I just wanted to clarify that. But I believe that if Palestinians were interested in peace or serious about honoring the 2-state solution, things would be a bit different than it is right now. I'll take, for instance, one example, which is very recent, as of less than a decade ago. As an extension of Israel wanting peace, they gave the Gaza, as I mentioned before, which they occupied to the Palestinian Arabs authorities. And what came as a result, instead of using it to establish settlements, to house their fellow Palestinian Arabs, thousands and thousands of rockets were built in hospitals where their civilians congregate, often to launch missiles and rockets into the Israel territory. The record says that giving land for peace does not establish peace. Yet the opposite has been true. And I truly believe that why can't peace? I don't believe that peace can be established in the Middle East, because if you go to the website for the Palestinian Authority and you research this on your spare time and you study their map, all they have is Palestine. There is no place at all for Israel. So here, as a critical thinker, I can see that their entire goal ultimately is to remove the Jews from the land. Now, what is the goal of the Jews? They would love to live in peace. I mean, they have shown us historically. And if we study this issue objectively, we notice Israel has been willing to give up land for peace, whether it's the Golan Heights, the Gaza, and the West Bank. I wish I could say the same for the Palestine. And I'm going to pass it to you prematurely.
Okay. I think your first point was the Arabs initiated invasion. Not that we're really talking about Jerusalem anymore, but you said the Arabs initiated invasion. As I already said, Egypt never even got a plane off the ground. They were waiting in the Sinai. So they didn't have any air power. They won through air power basically. So they fought Egypt in '67. They fought Egypt in the Sinai, and they had already Egypt had Russian tanks, but they had developed tanks specifically for that terrain in the Sinai Peninsula. And since they had all the air power, the Egyptian forces really didn't stand much of a chance anyway. They were going to win that war no matter what. Interestingly, this just came out, so I'm just going to add this fact in that they believe they're actually going to use nuclear weapons, even if it came down to it, in the Sinai Peninsula. And I mean, you couldn't even make this stuff up. As far as giving land away, and the thing is, they took all this land through force to begin with. And and these people live under an occupation. So even if they're getting a handout, they're getting a handout from their oppressor, and they had a very strong economy, and they're actually extremely educated people, and how can you build an economy when you live under an occupation, which is different in both places. But I think you're talking about Gaza, so I'll talk about Gaza. It's completely barricaded. They control how many calories these people eat every day. I mean, they don't have any right to self-determination or to prosperity. And if they pulled out, it doesn't matter. It was part of Egypt.
Okay. I mean, look, if a lie is repeated enough, it too will become a truth. Just because it's repeated everywhere doesn't actually make it true, which is why I know that Palestinian Arabs and Arabs in Muslim majority countries are raised hating the Jews. They're taught to believe that Jerusalem was a Muslim city, and that some hateful foreigners calling themselves Jews came out of nowhere and occupied Jerusalem and took over territories that was their rightful heirs. And this is the propaganda that that is just being like thrown out there, and people are just believing because they just hear it often. And this is not the case. And I provided the evidence to substantiate this. And I've even talked to you about how you have in Israel, you have 60% of Palestinian Arabs who make up the population and who vote in elections and who are integrated. And so when you say they don't have no self-determination, I mean, what is impeding your ability to see the facts that I'm giving you, to see the information I'm giving you? Why aren't you disputing the information I'm giving you? But let's leave that for a different topic. That could be something you can address when your time comes. But I believe that the primary focus of a lot of the Arab Muslim world is removing the Jews from Israel. They don't want a two-state solution. Jews and Arab Muslims living by side by side. They don't want a temple to be built on what was called the Temple Mount, or where the Dome of the Rock is. They want the Jews to leave entirely. Now, if you examine this issue objectively, look at the map of the entire Middle East. I mean, you're known for showing me maps in our last debate. Now, if you examine this issue objectively, look at the map of the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Libya, Lebanon, Pakistan, Turkey, Afghanistan. I could go on. And even like Somalia, down the Middle East. In comparison to Israel, you can hardly see Israel on the map. Now, I named 10 different Arab countries. Can you explain to me rationally why none of these rich Arab countries have not vowed to accept Palestinian Arabs into their country to take care of them? There's currently hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees in Palestine who have not been integrated into the Palestinian culture. And it's probably in the millions. And you have a vast Muslim majority countries in the Middle East.
Okay, well, you're not really moving your case forward with a timeline. So I think it's really difficult for me to even try to begin to explain the flaws here. Obviously, I put my statements on a timeline. I invite you to do that. I think that would really give some clarity, at least so you could argue this better in the future. And you're also kind of really overgeneralizing. I think with Arabs and Palestinians, it's impossible for 100% of them to be 100 to not want peace and to demand a two-state solution. morally, they do deserve a two-state solution, because that was what was promised to them when the authority to partition the land and split it in half took place. They were given the right to a nation state. So morally, the two-state solution would be the best solution. But the only problem is that now they've gone, one side has gone from being 10% of the population with 55% of the land to an overwhelming majority. I don't have a number offhand, with over 90% of the land. And I really wish I had a better answer for why the Arab states won't take their refugees, but because that's also very puzzling to me. But I can tell you this much, is that they have as I already stated, the reason that they have a problem with the recognition is the occupation of Jerusalem, and they've actually offered to recognize them and be peaceful with them, so forth and so on, if they would just stop what they're doing to the Palestinians. So even if they won't take them, they're still not happy about that situation.
I've addressed that idea already. About, you talk about the occupation, if we're going to occupy. I addressed that already. And after debate, you can see why I addressed it. Because this is not the case. They really do. I mean, I personally believe, from statements I read from their leaders, they are hell bent on removing Israel from the land. They do not like Israel. They hate them, and you're making it seem like there's anything that the Jews can do moving forward that's going to change anything. I mean, they've tried negotiations. They've tried it. They've all failed. They've all failed, and it's really a gimmick. I mean, because look, a man's enemies are the look. A man's enemy is easier. It's easier for a man's enemy to kill him inside of his own home than it is from the outside. You know, because if you have an enemy living in your home, it'll be easier for the outside to work with them in unison to overthrow you, rather than it is if they were from the outside. And so I believe the reason, I'll answer the question for you. The reason why they're keeping them there is so that they can continue to influence terrorist activity inside of Israel, and so that they can better help them overthrow Israel than it would be for them. That's why they're keeping them there. That's the real reason why. That's the real reason. And there's no other way around it. That is the main reason why they won't take in their own Arab brethren, because they know that they sympathize with them. They know that this is a holy war. They know that according to their beliefs, they must exterminate the Jews. And if it means lying about Jerusalem is theirs, they will do that. And whatever means necessary, because I believe Yasser Arafat, Osama bin Laden, and Abu Baghdadi of ISIS have all come to the front to represent the radical edge of their political agenda, which is based upon their faith, according to them. And certainly, we are not looking at peace. They were looking at someone who believes in a call to arms to take over the world and what they perceive as Islamic holdings that have left occupation to infidels like Israel, according to them.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and touch on the mosque, that Al-Aqsa. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, and I apologize. You said something very interesting. You said that they would object to a temple being built on the Temple Mount. The thing is that mosque is built on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is its foundation that it rests on. The Jewish temple, unfortunately, was destroyed by the Romans. So their temple was already destroyed. And when the Arabs came in and took over later, they built their religious site there. And this is actually one of the holiest sites. I believe it's the third holiest site to Islam. It's where they believe that Muhammad descended into heaven. So it's a very special site to them. And it's actually also a very special site to Christians as well. This is the site that Jesus, this is the temple that Jesus, it's hard for me to explain biblical history, but where he chased the people away who were charlatans or whatever. So it's actually an important site to Christians that they might lose as well. As far as these negotiations failing, the first thing that happens before every negotiation is Israel builds more settlements. So it's kind of hard to have a fair negotiation when you're taking more land, and the land actually happens to be around Jerusalem. So it makes it so that the West Bank is split away from Jerusalem. So Israel has the whole sum of Jerusalem, and it's split away from the West Bank. So it really makes the possibility of having two states impossible, because of course the Palestinians also want this as their capital. It's not supposed to be the capital of Israel, but it is.
Well, I mean, it is I mean, it is like, I mean, I gave you historical in documentation in like when we started off the debate, that it is historically, Jews have historically lived there. And you know, even in Jesus' record, I mean, because you do mention that you know, Jesus was very known in that particular Jerusalem, and he walked there, and so it's sacred to Christians. And yes, you are correct on that point. And the thing is that when Jesus was there, when he came, he was hailed by the Jews. He was under Jewish elites. He was facing confrontations with the Jewish elites, and so this is the main reason why I mentioned that, you know, Jews in Jerusalem are just so synonymous with one another, because you know, you have, you know, even King David, I mean, I believe he called Jerusalem, I believe he called it the city founded by David, or something along those lines. And so David was ancestor of Jesus, and he came along, and that's the family lineage of Jesus. And so Jesus came from his family lineage. And so he founded, and so King David founded Jerusalem, and he reigned over Israel in a time period that predated Jesus, and Jesus predated the Islamic conquest. And so this is why I make the claim that, you know, this land had like had from its beginning been for the Jewish descendants. It has always been, Jews have always existed in this land, and Arabs and the Muslim faith have come around later on, making lies and substantiating their lies, and saying that, hey, this land was stolen from us. And you focus on modern history, you'll always come to that conclusion. But if you go to the source, you go to the original, you go to the very beginning, you'll always see unapologetically it was always the Jews in that land. I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. You keep talking about the Bible as if the Bible were an historic document, and it just isn't. And I'm not here today to have that debate. The thing that's interesting here is that someone else puts it, someone who talks about this, they always say God is not a real estate agent. But the thing is, like with these settlements, that might be an excuse to take land and build a settlement, or at least just to take the land away from the Palestinians, is that they might try to dig there and try to see if they can find King David, because they haven't found any evidence that King David existed. They might try to dig and find that. But the thing is, there's just no historical evidence, and we can't rely on the Bible as a historical document. Maybe part of it is true, but I think the way the debater put it the other night, by saying like maybe we should draw the line at parting the seas, the idea that would actually be a straightforward historical document, and that God would be a real estate agent. That's not my original line. Someone else. Anyway, those are both silly ideas. It doesn't really, like I said, it's a legal issue, and it starts with the partition in the 1940s, not 1917, because that's just a suggestion. That calls this an international city, and that's been abused from day one.
It's a legal issue and more. It's also a reformation of the faith that teaches violence against infidels and etc. Because that's where it all lies. I mean, that's where I believe it all lies. Until there's a major reform in the Muslim faith, I believe that they will continue to have this opinion and continue to breed their children with this opinion that the Jews stole Jerusalem, and they must be killed, they must be ran off the land, etc., etc. Now, you mentioned that you didn't talk about the Bible, and nor in my last statement did I don't recall mentioning the Bible, not once. I just mentioned things that you can find in secular sources about King David establishing that land in the period of time that he was in Israel, and then you can find the dates, and that's secular history. You can find that in secular documents. And King David's is a ancestor of Jesus. All these statements are not necessarily like Bible, like, yeah, they're in the Bible, but I mean, I didn't mention the Bible not once. You can find this in secular documents outside of the Bible. I mean, you have Flavius Josephus, Jewish historian. He wrote Antiquity of the Jews and mentioned Christ as a historical figure. He underscored his death, under Pontius Pilate, and later on his voice being a movement that came in the wake of resurrection. Look, the fact that we can substantiate Jesus and we can substantiate that he was in the land of Jerusalem, and that is enough to even be able to use as your basis for going to do some research into finding out who was the rightful heirs of Jerusalem. And I'm going to close by saying that I don't believe that. I believe the Jews have a right to exist. I believe Israel has a right to exist. I believe that they would be better at occupying the land of Jerusalem. I believe if they were to occupy, I believe that this conflict would potentially not be to such an aggression as it is right now. I believe the Arabs have plenty of land to go to their brethren's home, and they should just leave Israel alone, and Israel never stole Jerusalem because it is rightfully theirs from the beginning.